Who was better? Maybe the answer doesn't matter, because legends don't compete. Legends live forever. Rome, 1972. The sun is beating down on the ancient stones of the Colosseum. Two men stand in the center of the arena. One is the Dragon, the fastest man from the East, Bruce Lee. The other is the undefeated champion of the West, Chuck Norris. They are about to film the most iconic fight scene in cinematic history. The script is written, the outcome is decided. Bruce Lee wins, Chuck Norris dies. The director yells, "Action!" But in that moment, everyone on set, the cameramen, the crew, even Bruce Lee's wife, Linda, had the same terrifying thought running through their minds. What if this wasn't a movie? What if the director never yelled, "Cut"? What if there were no rules, no referees, and no script? If these two men locked themselves in a cage and fought to the death, who would actually walk out alive? Welcome back. Today we are not talking about the Hollywood magic. We are talking about the truth that happened behind closed doors. Because everyone has seen Way of the Dragon, but almost no one knows about the private sparring sessions in the hotel rooms, or why Bruce Lee hand-picked Chuck Norris for this role. You see, Chuck Norris is an internet meme today, but in the early 1970s, he wasn't a joke. He was a monster. He was the world professional karate champion, undefeated for 6 years. Bruce Lee didn't want an actor for his movie. He wanted a predator. He wanted someone who could legitimately kill him. So why did Bruce Lee take the risk? Was the legend of their corridor fights real? And the biggest question of all, why in a rare interview years later did Chuck Norris refuse to say Bruce could beat him? Buckle up. This isn't just a movie set story. This is a war of philosophies. It all started with a phone call. Bruce Lee picked up the phone in Hong Kong and dialed a number in the United States. He had a problem. He needed an opponent for the finale who looked like a legitimate threat. Not a bodybuilder, a killer. Bruce got Chuck on the line. The conversation was short, arrogant, and legendary. Bruce said, "Chuck, I'm making a movie. I want you to be my opponent." Chuck laughed and asked, "Who wins?" Bruce instantly replied, "I win because it's my movie." Chuck went silent for a moment. Then he delivered the line that sparked the rivalry. "Okay, Bruce, but beating me in the script doesn't mean you can beat me in real life." Right there, the challenge was thrown. Two alphas, two different worlds, Kung Fu versus karate. When they landed in Rome, the tension was thick. Chuck Norris wasn't there to play games. He was a competitor. Bruce Lee was fast, flashy, and he had a point to prove to the world. They checked into their hotel. The crew thought they were just going to rehearse the choreography, but late that night, strange sounds started coming from the hotel hallway. Shouts, heavy thuds against the walls, the sound of furniture moving. The hotel staff was terrified. They crept down the hallway toward the room. Was it a fight? Was it a murder? When they finally opened the door, what they saw was far more shocking than anything in the movie. When the hotel staff peeked into the room, they didn't see a murder scene, but they saw something equally terrifying. The room was a mess. Furniture was pushed against the walls, sweat was dripping from the ceiling, and in the center of the chaos, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris were standing face to face, panting, bruising, smiling. They weren't fighting to the death, not yet. They were exchanging secrets. You have to understand the context. In 1972, martial arts was divided into tribes. If you did karate, you moved in straight lines, you blocked hard, you punched from the hip. It was rigid, it was powerful, it was like a tank. Chuck Norris was the ultimate version of this machine. He absorbed pain, he broke bricks, he was unshakable. Bruce, he was the opposite. He hated styles, he called them cages. He believed in being formless, like water. But water can't hurt a rock unless it crashes into it with immense speed. So every night in that hallway, they tested this theory. Chuck Norris later admitted in his biography, "We worked out for 4 hours a day. We kicked into pads until our legs were numb. We exchanged theories until our brains hurt." But here is the detail that most historians miss. Bruce wasn't just training with Chuck, he was downloading him. Bruce Lee was a thief, a genius thief. He looked at Chuck's massive legs. He saw how Chuck could deliver a high kick without losing his balance. At that time, Bruce rarely kicked above the waist. Traditional Wing Chun didn't believe in high kicks. But after meeting Chuck, suddenly Bruce's kicks started going higher, faster, more precise. Some people say Bruce taught Chuck how to be fast. Others say Chuck taught Bruce how to kick high. But the truth behind those closed doors was much darker. Bruce was trying to find a crack in the armor. He knew that if they fought in a tournament under point fighting rules, Chuck would probably win. Chuck knew how to play the game, but Bruce didn't care about points. He cared about termination. One night, during a sparring session, things got a little too real. The speed increased, the control slipped. Chuck threw a spinning back kick, his signature move. It wasn't a movie kick, it was a knockout blow intended to take a man's head off. Bruce didn't block it. If he had blocked it, his arm would have shattered. Instead, he did something that shocked Chuck Norris, something that defied the logic of karate. He moved into the kick. He stepped inside the danger zone, inches away from impact, suffocating the power before it could explode. Chuck froze. He realized for the first time that he wasn't fighting a martial artist, he was fighting a physicist who understood the geometry of violence better than anyone on Earth. But Chuck Norris had a secret weapon too, something Bruce Lee didn't have. Something that could end the fight in a single second if Bruce made one wrong calculation. So what was Chuck Norris's secret weapon? It wasn't a kick, it wasn't a punch, it was density. Chuck Norris was built like a tank. His bones were conditioned by years of smashing concrete blocks. Bruce Lee knew that if he got hit cleanly by just one of Chuck's haymakers, the fight would be over. Bruce was fragile, Chuck was unbreakable. That was the dynamic. Speed versus concrete. But before they could settle this score on camera, they had to pull off one of the biggest heists in cinema history. Here's a detail that most fans don't know. They didn't have permission to film inside the Colosseum. The Italian government had said no, but Bruce Lee didn't understand the word no. Bruce and his crew didn't walk in through the front door like tourists. They smuggled the cameras in bags. They bribed Italian officials with cash and handshakes. They had exactly 1 hour before the police figured out what was happening. So those shots you see in the movie, the establishing shots of them warming up on the ancient walls, that wasn't acting. That was hurrying. The tension on their faces was real. They were looking over their shoulders, waiting for the sirens. Once they got the shots, they escaped back to Hong Kong to film the actual fight scenes in a studio. But the atmosphere of death followed them. For the next week, the Golden Harvest studio became a torture chamber. Bruce Lee, as the director, was a perfectionist. He didn't want a movie fight. He wanted a documentary of violence. They filmed for 45 hours just to get 10 minutes of footage. Imagine the physical toll. Under the scorching studio lights, the temperature rose to over 100 degrees. They were dehydrated, their muscles were cramping, and the contact was getting harder. You see, when two master fighters move at that speed, accidents happen. Pulling a punch, faking a hit, requires trust. But in the heat of the moment, when adrenaline takes over, trust evaporates. Crew members reported that the sound of the impacts changed. At first, it was the slap of skin on skin. By day 3, it was the thud of bone on bone. Chuck Norris was landing kicks that left deep bruises on Bruce's chest. Bruce was landing side kicks that sent tremors through Chuck's spine. At one point, Bruce yelled, "Cut!" not because the take was bad, but because he needed to remind himself that he was supposed to win. Chuck was so dominant, so imposing, that Bruce had to rewrite the choreography on the fly. He realized that Dragon style wasn't enough to beat the tank. He had to cheat. This is where the genius and the cruelty of Bruce Lee came out. He changed the rhythm. In the movie, you see Bruce bite Chuck's leg. You see him rip hair out of Chuck's chest. That wasn't just for the script. That was Bruce Lee admitting, "I cannot beat this man with honor. I have to fight dirty." It was a psychological confession caught on tape. Bruce knew that in a clean refereed match, Chuck Norris was a nightmare. So he turned the Colosseum into a street fight. But the scariest moment didn't happen during the fighting. It happened during the break. There is a famous shot of a kitten watching them fight. It symbolizes innocence amidst brutality. But off camera, something else was watching them, something dark. On the final day of shooting, Bruce Lee sat in his chair, completely exhausted. He looked at Chuck, wiped the fake blood and real blood off his lip, and said something that haunted Chuck for decades. He talked about time. He talked about how he felt like his engine was running too hot, like a race car redlining before it explodes. Chuck Norris looked at this young, vibrant man, the fittest man on the planet, and saw a shadow over him. Bruce was winning the fight on screen, but he was losing the war against his own body. And then the final take happened, the death scene. When Bruce Lee snapped Chuck Norris's neck in the movie, the silence on the set was deafening. It looked too real. It felt too final. The cameras stopped rolling. The crew applauded, but Bruce didn't smile. He stood over the dead body of Chuck Norris, looking at his hands. He had created his masterpiece, but he had also sealed his fate. Because less than a year later, the world would realize that Way of the Dragon wasn't just a movie, it was a farewell letter. But who really won? If we strip away the script, the cameras, and the bribes, if we take the data from those 45 hours of brutal sparring, who is the true king of the Colosseum? The answer might surprise you. The movie came out. It shattered box office records. Bruce Lee became a god. Chuck Norris became a star. But for 50 years, the debate has never stopped. In forums, in dojos, in barbershops, men have argued over the same question. Okay, Bruce won the movie, but who wins the street fight? Let's stop the fanboy worship for a second. Let's look at the cold, hard data, because the answer is not as simple as Bruce is faster or Chuck is stronger. Here is the tale of the tape. Chuck Norris, 1972 World Middleweight Karate Champion. He wasn't just a point fighter, he was a full contact fighter with a background in judo. He was used to getting hit. He had the stamina to fight for rounds and rounds. Bruce Lee, an innovator, a street fighter, the fastest hands in human history. But, and this is a big but, he had zero professional fight record, no tournaments, no belts. Years later, in a candid interview, Chuck Norris was asked the ultimate question: if you and Bruce fought to the death, who would win? Chuck didn't say Bruce. He smiled that famous confident smile and said, "Bruce was good, but I was the professional fighter. I held the title. He was very good for a non-professional." That is a heavy statement. For a non-professional. It implies that there is a difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous in a sanctioned ring. So let's run the simulation. Let's put them back in that Colosseum, erase the cameras, and lock the gates.
Scenario A, the stand-up war. If the fight stays on the feet, Bruce Lee has the edge. Why? Because of interception. Karate is rhythm, 1-2 block kick. Jeet Kune Do is broken rhythm. Bruce wouldn't wait for Chuck to finish his kick. He would kick Chuck's leg while it was still in the air. Bruce's speed was a cheat code. He could land 3 strikes in the time it took Chuck to chamber 1 roundhouse kick. In a striking match, the dragon eats the tiger. But there is a scenario B, the ground game. This is Bruce Lee's nightmare. In 1972, Bruce was just starting to learn grappling from Jean LaBelle. He was a novice on the ground. Chuck Norris held a brown belt in judo and had wrestled in the military. If Chuck Norris could eat 1 punch, just 1, and grab Bruce Lee, if he could clinch him and drag him to the concrete, the speed advantage vanishes. On the ground, you can't be like water. You are just a body being crushed by gravity and leverage. Chuck weighed 165 pounds of dense muscle. Bruce was a fluctuating 135. If Chuck got on top, he would maul him. So, the verdict? It depends on the first 10 seconds. If Bruce ends it early with a strike to the throat or eyes, Bruce wins. If Chuck survives the blitz and grabs him, Chuck wins. It's the classic striker versus grappler debate, decades before the UFC existed. But there is one factor that statistics cannot measure: the killer instinct. Chuck Norris was a sportsman. He fought for points and trophies. Bruce Lee was paranoid. He fought for survival. Bruce carried a gun. He chewed raw meat. He trained as if assassins were coming for him every day. In a street fight, the man who is willing to bite, to scratch, to do the unthinkable, usually has the edge. Bruce respected Chuck. He respected him enough to kill him in his movie. He knew that Chuck was the only man who could beat him, and that fear, that respect, is what made their chemistry so electric. But as the filming wrapped and they shook hands in Rome, neither of them knew that the clock was ticking. The game of death was approaching, and the lessons Bruce learned from Chuck Norris about kicks, about rhythm, would be the final pieces of the puzzle before he left this world. Because 12 months later, the dragon would fall, and the Titan, Chuck Norris, would be left alone to carry the torch. He would become the biggest action star in America, but in every interview for the next 40 years, he would always look back at that rooftop in Rome with a strange look in his eyes. A look that says, "We were young, we were gods, and we almost killed each other."
So, why does this fight matter? Why are we still talking about 2 guys fighting in a Roman ruin 50 years ago? Because that scene in Way of the Dragon wasn't just an action sequence, it was a prophecy. Look closely at the choreography. Bruce Lee starts with traditional kung fu. It fails. Chuck Norris beats him up. Then Bruce changes. He starts bouncing like Muhammad Ali. He starts kicking high like Chuck Norris. He uses grappling. He bites. He adapts. In that 10-minute scene, Bruce Lee showed the world the future of combat. He showed us that style is a trap. Decades later, Dana White, the president of the UFC, would say, "Bruce Lee is the father of mixed martial arts." And who was the midwife? Chuck Norris. Without Chuck, Bruce would have remained a traditionalist. Chuck forced Bruce to evolve. He was the iron that sharpened the iron. Those bruises in the hotel room, those painful sparring sessions, they were the laboratory where modern fighting was invented. July 20th, 1973. Less than a year after they shook hands in Rome, the dragon was gone. The news shocked the world. At the funeral in Seattle, thousands of people gathered to say goodbye to the man who changed everything. And there in the front row, carrying the heavy casket of his friend, was Chuck Norris, the enemy, the rival, the monster.
He wasn't there as a competitor, he was there as a brother. Chuck Norris went on to become an American icon. Walker, Texas Ranger, Delta Force, a living legend. But he never forgot the man who pushed him to his limits. In a quiet moment years later, Chuck said, "Bruce was like a meteor. He burned bright, he burned hot, and then he was gone. But the fire he started, that fire never went out." Today, every time you watch a UFC fight, every time you see a fighter mix boxing with wrestling, every time you see a spinning back kick knockout, you are watching the echoes of that secret war in the Colosseum. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris didn't just fight each other. They fought against the limits of what a human being can do, and together they won. So, who was better? Maybe the answer doesn't matter, because legends don't compete. Legends live forever.